welcoming you. Thank you for joining us for a session on securing your board information in a digital age. And I'm delighted. I'm Kevin Rennie. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Chief Operations Officer at NHS Providers, and I'm delighted to welcome Mark and Dottie from Board Effect, which is a brand of the Diligent company. So I'm not going to say much more other than just in terms of format, and then I'll hand straight over to Dottie and Mark to drive the session. The format is they'll present some content. There'll be a few questions as they go through, and then there'll be a question and answer session at the end, which I'll take part in. I'm not an expert, but I'll be joining in as a sort of a part of that team, and then I'll come back at the end and close. So mostly this will be driven by my colleagues at Board Effect. So over to you, Dottie and Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. It's great to be here with you. My name is Dottie Schindlinger, and if you can't tell from my accent, I'm from the US. So I live right outside of Philadelphia. I am one of the founding team members of Board Effect, and now I work with Diligent Corporate as the executive director of the Diligent Institute, which is our corporate governance research arm and think tank. And I'm joined today by my wonderful colleague, Mark Wilson, who is a governance advisor with Board Effect. Mark and I have collaborated on a few things in the past, but this is the first presentation that we've done together. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to work with Mark today. Mark, thank you so much for doing this with me.
You're welcome, Dottie. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I've been with Board Effect for nearly 4 years within the kind of governance space. And generally within my role is to give assistance and explore options for organisations who are looking to review their governance processes, certainly now in a digital age and where they're looking to make some changes, Dottie.
Well, it's great to have you with me. And for those who are not quite sure what Board Effect is, I'll just very briefly say Board Effect is software that is designed around secure communication for boards and senior leadership teams of organizations. And so this topic that we're going to be covering today is really near and dear to our hearts. What we wanted to do was focus in on some of the things that are happening around cyber risk specifically, but then broaden the lens a bit to talk more generally about how boards and leadership teams can communicate securely in this digital age. The past 16 months have been quite challenging in every way. But one of the ways that I think we all experienced a challenge was having to do every bit of our processes remotely. And that included meetings of the board, that included meetings of the senior leadership team. And so we had to figure out how to do that well. And obviously, selecting the right video conferencing system was a very important component of that. But that's not the only decision that goes into how to have a meeting securely and well when we can't gather together in a room safely. And so we want to focus a bit on those wraparound processes. How can we communicate clearly and efficiently and regularly when we are remote? Then we also want to talk about what happens from here. Things are beginning to get a little bit better. I just received a notice today that the EU is going to be allowing fully vaccinated people to travel country to country again this summer. So I think we're beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we may be able to start gathering again in person safely. And so as that begins to be true, what of the lessons that we've learned over the last 16 months are we going to carry forward? What are some of the efficiencies that we've gained and new ways of communicating new information that we've been able to share with one another that we might not want to lose, even when we start to go back to in-person meetings? So I think it's helpful to just lay out some of that context. I also want to observe that this is a really interesting time to be talking about cyber risk, given what's happening with the healthcare system in Ireland. Obviously, I know that the national health system had quite a difficult time with a cyber attack a number of years ago. But this ransomware attack, this latest ransomware attack happening in Ireland on the healthcare system, really could happen kind of anywhere. It could happen to any healthcare system or any organization around the world. And so it's useful to take a moment and look at that incident and sort of figure out, okay, what can we really learn from this? We cannot make our systems or our companies impervious to attack, but what we can do is learn how to quickly recover and be resilient when an attack happens. And we can also make sure that we're taking really good steps to minimize the number of attacks and the severity of attacks when they occur. So we're going to talk about all these issues. I hope that doesn't sound terribly dry. I think you're going to find this to be a very interesting and stimulating conversation. We will be going for just about an hour, but we really want to hear from you. There's going to be a few times throughout this presentation that we're going to pose some questions to you and ask you to tell us your thoughts. And we'll be doing that either through the poll system, which will come up on your screen as we ask those questions, or we'll just ask you to share your thoughts in the Q&A box. But we also want to hear whatever is on your mind. If this is a topic that is really hot for your organization, tell us what you're thinking about. Tell us where your constraints and concerns are, and we'll do our best to address them or to maybe provide some additional information that would be helpful to you. So let's start actually with just finding out where people are. So let's launch this first poll question. What we'd like to know is whether or not the topic of how to discuss cyber risk and cybersecurity in the boardroom, how frequently does that topic of conversation come up for your organization? Is your board talking about that several times a year, maybe only once a year, maybe only once or twice in the last 5 years? Or maybe you've never talked about it at the board level. I bet that never option isn't going to get clicked that often, but let's find out. So go ahead and vote on this topic for us, and we'll see what the results are going to be. Mark, do you have any predictions of what we're going to see?
Well, I'm hoping for several times a year. However,
Me
based
too.
on experience, it may be a couple of times a year. Wait and see. It'll be interesting, Dottie.
Yeah, it is one of these things where we all recognize that managing cybersecurity is something that doesn't really happen at the board level, right? The board is not directly involved in setting up perimeter defenses and securing networks, but the board does play a very important role in overseeing cyber risk for the organization as a source of enterprise-wide risk. So let's go ahead and see what our results are. If you wouldn't mind sharing that on the screen, that would be helpful. Great. Okay, wonderful. So this is actually very encouraging because having done this same presentation a few times in the past, I can happily tell you 45% is the highest number I've yet seen for the response of several times a year. Much more commonly, I see once or twice in the last 5 years. So I would say if your organization is in that camp, in that once or twice in the last 5 years or once a year camp, that might not be frequent enough. One of the things that is really true about cyber risk is that it is an incredible source of risk. And let's just talk about how large of a source of risk this really is. I often have the opportunity to interview different leaders on our podcast, the Corporate Director Podcast. And one of the individuals that I recently interviewed a few months ago is a gentleman by the name of Larry Clinton, who is the president of the Internet Security Alliance. And they work internationally on policies around cyber defense and cyber risk. And one of the things he always points out to me is that cybercrime as a global enterprise is now a $6 trillion a year enterprise. Just to put that in context, if that was a country, it would qualify for admission to the G7. So cybercrime is a massive enterprise, and any one of our organizations against a $6 trillion enterprise is going to be challenged. So one of the things that we need to be kind of conscious of and thinking about is how can we all be working together to help shore up defenses and ensure that we have good cybersecurity in place. As you can imagine, something of that type of existential threat should be on the minds of directors all the time. And even if they are not cyber experts, they should be able to have a level of comfort talking about the level of risk involved with cybersecurity. And so take it, a good analogy would be finance, right? We don't all need to be certified public accountants in order to talk about the annual audit or to review the financial statements and have a conversation at the board level about finance. But we are expected to be able to have those conversations even if we don't have that background. We're supposed to be able to very comfortably read the P&L statement, read the financial statements, and comment and ask questions. The same is true for cyber risk. We don't need to be computer scientists in order to ask good questions. It is part of the board's responsibility to have those kinds of conversations. The other aspect of this then is how does the board communicate itself? this is often a gap in the security defense of an organization where they've tightened down everything within the organization, they've tightened down all the networks and all the firewalls, but then they're emailing information out to the board as attachments. That's a really risky thing to do because it's risky for two reasons. One is that email is notorious for being breached. It is very easy to breach email, especially free open systems like Gmail, Yahoo Mail, Hotmail, AOL. These things have been breached multiple times. So sending attachments, you might as well just assume that people who are not on your board are reading those. Additionally, the other aspect of that risk is that you're then kind of saying to the board, please download any attachment that I send you. And the problem is that is the most common way that ransomware attacks start, is that someone downloads an attachment to an email, or they click on a link in an email, and that downloads the script of ransomware, and right away the network has been compromised. So it's something to really think about in terms of cyber risk. It's not just about the risk of the enterprise and how boards need to oversee that risk. It's also about their own personal risk. And are they contributing to the risk of the enterprise by just using the wrong communication practices? So I want to talk about this from the perspective of how should the board be overseeing cyber risk? One of the things that I think is really important is that we often talk about cybersecurity, but when we're at the board level, it's really better to be thinking about cyber risk. Again, they're not going to be, looking at the scripts and seeing how things are being kept secure or not. They need to look at this more holistically as an area of enterprise risk. So the board plays that critical role in asking questions and getting regular reports. There should be regular reports coming from the information security team. And it doesn't have to be reports at the level of here's how many attacks we thwarted today. It's more so, what is our policy around keeping our systems patched and up to date? Patching, which sounds so unbelievably boring, is actually one of the simplest ways to stop about 96% of cyber attacks. 96% of cyber attacks are caused because of bad patching of software and of systems. So what's our policy around this? How frequently are we doing it? How are we ensuring that every single bit of equipment that is owned by the institution is being patched on the same frequency? Boards should be asking questions like that. They should be asking questions like, what is our communication plan when we have a cyber attack? Who's involved? Who plays what role, and what does the board need to do? What is their role? And then again, as I mentioned, how are we protecting the information that gets shared among senior executives and the board? Often that information is some of the most sensitive that the organization has. And often, unfortunately, that is where there are a lot of security gaps. These individuals are being targeted by criminals. Don't misjudge. They are absolutely in the crosshairs of those who are keen to get access to your systems. Think about it. If a senior leader maybe is not as comfortable with using technology because of his or her age, or maybe not having come from a technical background, that person is really quite an interesting target. They have access to very sensitive information. They're sharing it all the time, and they're not very adept at using their systems. That makes them a very ripe target for bad action. So how are we thinking about some of these things as we look at our whole cybersecurity program and cyber risk posture? I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Mark, to talk a bit more about how this plays out for organizations from a modern governance perspective.
Hi, Dottie. Thank you very much for that introduction. So what I've highlighted here is kind of 4 key areas where there's new approaches to modern governance based on my experience of speaking to organisations similar to who's on this call today. So the first one I've highlighted was central online repository for boards and executive. You touched on that in the last few slides about the availability for board members and trustees and how they access that, and how it is actually detrimental, in the first instance about cybersecurity, for information to be sent through by email, potentially Gmail account to their own account. And what we're finding with trustees is they want that information to make good decisions, but they can't do that if they're getting it in a large PDF format with 300 pages. And how do they then make their notes? So what we're finding is organisations are transferring this information to a central online repository. So they have that one stop or one single source of truth where both trustees and internal staff can go there and source that information. And what it does do is provide that secure space. So no information is held on their own devices, what you touched on, Dottie. And I think if we all take a step back, our own PCs are never going to have the same level of security as a corporate PC. So it gives that peace of mind, both from the trustees' perspective and the organisational, that it is a secure platform. So if, for instance, I receive an email from Kevin as part of the NHS Providers, within a secure platform, no documents will ever be held in there. And I would know from Kevin that that's a secure link I'm clicking on. As you mentioned before, this is about malware and ransomware. And what it does do is then give this secure, comfortable platform that both all the trustees, the board members, the internal staff can then collaborate through a virtual meeting environment, which has become the norm over the last 14, 15 months. And on top of that, it gives that ability for the internal team also to have the ability to collate all the information within that secure area. So things we'll touch on during the course of the next hour about surveys and making decisions out with meetings to have it in that secure area. And they don't have to look at multiple different solutions within their organisation to access and deliver against their governance objectives, Dottie.
So sorry, I'm trying to get my mute button to work. So Mark, could you talk to us a little bit about, in the conversations that you've been having with boards, how have they been making this transition from, kind of traditional communication styles with boards and senior executives to using, better, more secure systems? How does that go?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's every organisation is different, although they all have, a set area, which is, we want to make this digital transformation, make everything more secure. What I've highlighted here is two, what I would say is traditional options when speaking to clients. One, the postal method, which was the norm. Everybody got the papers in a timely manner. As a trustee, you'd write down your notes and then turn up for the meeting. The challenges around that, of course, is many, particularly from the organisational aspect. Time to actually collate this information, bind it together, then post it out. And that even has that security aspect around that. Do you send it by courier, or do you just put it through the post and hope the trustee's in on that day to actually get that information? And I remember speaking to a finance director a few years ago, and when I spoke to him initially, I said, why are you thinking of changing your governance processes? And he said, Mark, I have overall responsibility for corporate services, and one of the papers was never received at the trustee's home, and I had 3 nights without any sleep, and I had to contact the information commissioner. So these are the type of challenges, the real challenges organisations face, as well as all the challenges around what happens in normal life, where papers have to be changed. You then reprint all these, send it out to the organisation. And of course, all organisations have the issue around, or the aspiration to make better environmental choices. And of course, printing 300-400 page documents multiple times every month over the course of a year, it's probably not the best environmental choice to make for your organisation. So that's one of the kind of key ones around post. Email, I think you've touched on that clearly, Dottie, about the security aspect of that. But also from the trustee, they're giving up their time to be part of your board and give their guidance. And is it really that easy for them to actually review a PDF with 300 pages? And can they make the annotations and notes to make a valuable contribution going into that actual meeting, as well as the security aspects about printing documents off at home? If they're lost, how do you actually retrieve that? Do you ask for them to send back their copies so you can shred it securely? So these are a couple of the traditional options before they actually look to review their governance processes, Dottie.
That's great. Well, let's find out what people in the audience are doing now. I'm curious to know how you're communicating with your board and your senior leadership team now. And so let's go ahead and open up the second poll question. And while we're waiting for that poll to get some responses, Mark, I'm curious to know, when you have conversations with people these days, especially given the pandemic and everyone working remotely, are you finding that the paper mailing is a little bit now in the rearview mirror? We're not really doing that as much anymore, or is that still something that organizations are doing?
I think the majority have stopped paper because it does have an impact on staff. You know, we're all, certainly the last 14, 15 months, not being advised to go into the office. So you're putting your staff ultimately at risk if you're asking them to go into the office to make that print. Secondly, also, I think there's and maybe get some thoughts from yourself, Dottie, but we're starting to see a new generation of trustees who actually do not want the paper copy. So we are seeing a shift, which of course the pandemic's probably made people go a little bit faster towards the digital transformation. But it is a mixture, I would say, at this moment in time, Dottie.
That's been my experience too, Mark. I think everyone probably has one or two trustees on their board who are really happy to have that paper copy and don't want to let it go. And that's fine. You know, it's not a problem for them to print it out. But I think the vast majority now would much prefer to have the digital copy so they can read it on their phone. They can, read it on their tablet or their computer and mark it up with annotations and not have this big stack of paper that they have to then figure out what to do with after the fact. So let's go ahead and share the results. Let's see what people say about how they're currently getting information out to their board. Okay, so we've got 57% who are using some type of secure communication platform. That's great. And again, not super surprising given that we've all had to learn how to work remotely and do that well. But we still have about 29% that are using some combination of emails, snail mail, phone calls, and another 14% doing something else. For those of you that answered something else, I'd love for you to put us some notes in the Q&A box and sort of let us know what that something else is. It'd be just very good to understand, what are some of the different ways that you're communicating with your leadership. That's very helpful. Mark, anything surprising there for you?
I'm actually pleasantly surprised that we're over the kind of 50% mark with regards to organisations going to a software platform, and as you say, it's still quite a large percentage, 29%, who are still with the email. But maybe that is not through choice. Maybe it's just cultural changes, which we both are aware of, can be one of the kind of key barriers to organisations making that transformation change, Dottie.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Well, let's continue on because I think it's good to kind of understand, how do you ensure that nothing gets lost? You mentioned before, Mark, in your presentation about some of the issues of using email, and I would bet one of the other things that is a difficulty with using email is that then things get lost in the email inbox. So, do you want to talk a bit about what are some of the different ways that organizations that you work with are ensuring that nothing is getting lost? Did I lose you, Mark?
Yeah, no, I was on mute. It happens to us. Not the first time, it won't be the last time, I'm sure. So the first thing from speaking to organisations is having that kind of standard approach, because many organisations will have their board and then multiple committees underneath that. So it's essential to have a standard approach to how they manage those papers, and of course any minutes associated with that. And one of the areas I'm pleased to see it was over 50% have a board portal type solution, because as you mentioned, a lot of this confidential information, particularly even minutes which have not been approved, it's essential to make sure you have a standard approach to how you control where those papers and minutes are disseminated within and out with your organisation. The other area I kind of highlighted was new technology. We're all looking to try and ensure everybody's got access anytime, anywhere with regards to their papers. But how do you manage that from the perspective of allowing trustees or board members use their own devices, which can, of course, it gives the benefit of they're comfortable with that type of technology, but on the other hand, do you have the same level of security on their own devices? So one of the key ways you can do that is with, for example, ensure that no documents are available to download, so you have complete control of where that data is within your portal. Other areas, of course, is having the secure platform. So all the documents in one portal, so you've got that single source of truth we touched on. And then from a regulatory perspective, are you making sure that all that information is held within the portal in line with your conditions? So like speaking to NHS Trust, I believe some will have up to 20 years to hold minutes and agendas for board meetings. So you have to make sure it's in an area which will not be lost and people have direct access to. So these are some of the ways people can actually do that.
That's terrific. Thank you. Well, so the next thing I want to do is ask again the audience a question. This is a good question to maybe even talk about at the board level, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, those of you who are participating today. And you can just post that into the question box and direct that to me. If there was one thing that you could change about your current board communication, what would you change? And while you're thinking about your answer, I'll share with you some of the research that we did at Diligent Institute during the course of the pandemic. We actually conducted 2 different studies. The first was in March of 2020, so right at the beginning of all of the lockdowns, both in the US and in the UK. And we wanted to find out, how was governance changing? We asked the question, what are some of the things that are changing about governance? And what we heard from trustees at that time was that they were really having a lot more meetings. So meeting cadence increased, in some cases even tripled for their organizations. We also heard that the kinds of information that they were receiving from their organizations had also changed. In the past, the reports they were receiving were much more about, quarterly performance or, more longer range and a little bit higher level. And now they were getting information almost weekly that was looking at a very detailed view of the operations, whether or not there were any disruptions to the supply chain, what was happening with the employee base in terms of health and welfare. How were we protecting them from, contracting COVID-19? There was a lot of detailed information that the board was being provided. And this wasn't because they were asking the board to stray into the realm of management. It was more so because it was a crisis time and there was a feeling of all hands on deck. We all need to be aware of what's happening. We need to see the situation together and then plan out how are we going to address and beat this crisis. We then repeated the same study in December because we were interested to understand, had some of those changes become more permanent at that time, or had some of those changes ebbed a bit because the initial part of the crisis, the initial shock of the crisis had waned and we were now in a different place. And what we learned was that quite a bit of the new processes had remained. So we were hearing from board members that they still were receiving a regular cadence of information. The frequency of meetings had cut down a little bit, but there was just sort of a new operating rhythm. They were now regularly getting reports about operations in a really detailed fashion, and they really were liking that information. They didn't want that to stop, not because they were trying to get in the way of management or had any desire to tell the management what to do, but more so because they felt they could potentially reach into their networks and be really helpful. Particularly as things like the supply chain disruptions just continued and changed. At first, there was a global shortage on personal protective equipment, which was really critical, particularly for the healthcare sector. But later on, there were other things that they were having difficulty getting. Right now, there's a kind of a global supply shortage of chips for computers. So there's a lot of back orders on equipment, and not just computer equipment, but really any equipment that uses computer chips. So think things like automobiles. If there's a new fleet, part of your fleet that needs to be updated, ambulances and such, those things may be back ordered by several months because of this chip shortage. So there's quite a lot of things happening that board members want to be aware of because it has an impact on strategy and it has an impact on overall finance direction and operational control. So we were learning through these studies that the board wanted to have a much closer eye view on what was happening on the day-to-day. And so dashboard reporting became a very common thing for a lot of the boards that we spoke with. They were getting these regular dashboard reports. There were specific KPIs that they were keeping an eye on, and they wanted to have that information regularly updated. So that was something they were starting to receive through their board platforms or through regular Zoom meetings that were happening maybe once a week, maybe through a series of conference calls. But often they would have some type of a report that did not live on paper. It never lived on paper. It was sort of a living, breathing document that was getting updated regularly on a screen. And they could just go and check out the current numbers and let that inform, is it trending up or trending down? Might I need to make a call to my colleague who works in this industry to sort of find out what's happening over here? The other aspect of this that I would say is kind of interesting. An area of information that the boards told us they had started to monitor that they really had never monitored in this way before was the mental health and welfare of the senior executive team. And this is particularly true in the healthcare sector, that they were really seeing the toll that this pandemic was taking on the healthcare workforce. And then, bubbling that up to the executive team, the board was very concerned about the lack of sleep that their executives were receiving, whether their own health was being impacted, and how was their mental state. Did they need to take a break? It's very difficult to take a break in the middle of a global pandemic crisis, but sometimes it's absolutely critical to take a little break, or you're not going to be able to continue functioning. So boards were monitoring some of these new metrics that they really had not thought of in those ways before, at least not in this kind of crisis mode. And we've been hearing from directors that they feel that now they need to tap more into their own empathy as a skill that is really required to be a good director for any board at any level. And that's kind of an interesting change. Mark, while we're waiting for individuals in the audience to kind of share their thoughts about, what might they want to change about their governance processes, what are some of the things that you're hearing from organizations that you work with are changing during this time?
Thank you, Dottie. I think it's fascinating just to get some of the information you've said there. And speaking to organisations now, some of the key changes around the diversity of the board, and I know we're going to touch on that later in the session, but that's one of the key ones which we're speaking to organisations. Also, I think boards are now open to greater ideas about how they communicate and where they do this through, for example, remote meetings. It doesn't have to be face-to-face. Certainly within the public sector also, I think that it also focuses on, with a lot of organisations within the public sector, they have to actually publish their board meetings. So it has brought a kind of lens on how much governance the board makes and the committees to the senior leadership change. So all of those type of things around the visibility of it, how they access their papers, they're more open in general. I think it's a kind of key word, Dottie.
I think that's very true. Yeah, thank you for that, Mark. I think that's good insight. So one thing that I wanted to maybe touch on, and Mark, I'd love to ask you to talk about this a bit more extensively. I'll just share with you that I serve on the board of a small nonprofit organization. It's not in the healthcare sector, but it's a not-for-profit charity here in the U.S. And we were used to meeting in person in a 250-year-old farmhouse that's the historic property that we have to maintain in southern New Jersey. And I will say, so 250 years, by the way, is very historic here in the U.S. I'm sure many of you are saying, our new addition on the house is 250 years old, but at any rate, for us, that's a big deal. So we were used to meeting in person. And of course, because of the pandemic shutdowns, that had to stop. And so we were really pleased to be able to use our board platform as a way that we could share information real time across lots of different individual players. That included our full board, as well as the staff of the organization, and most especially our executive director. Because what happened for us was very interesting. In June of 2020, we got a notice that our executive director, who had been the head of the organization for the past 8 years and had been with our organization for the past 30 years, had decided this was the time to retire. And she was going to retire by the end of December. So that gave us 6 months to conduct an executive search in the middle of a pandemic. So I was asked to chair that search committee, and I can tell you, if we had not had this capability available, I don't know how we would have done it. We needed to have a central repository where we were able to access resumes of candidates, the needs assessment that we conducted, which we did all remotely using a combination of tools, including online surveys and individual Zoom meetings with various stakeholder groups. We needed to be able to communicate with one another about the merits of different candidates. And we actually used our board platform to create a scoring sheet for each interview. And we could then tally up the results and see the scores of individual candidate interviews. Every interview was conducted remotely. It was quite a process. And if we hadn't had one central place where everything lived, I think I would have lost my mind. We were meeting every single week. When everything was done, we had more than 25 interviews. We had over 80 candidates apply for the position. We were able to screen those with the help of a consultant, but it was quite a process, and we were able to get it done on the deadline. And our new executive director began right after the new year. So I will say that having one place where you can go and it's a single source of truth, to use Mark's term, is so incredibly critical. For us, the other component was security. When you're in the middle of an executive search, the worst thing that can happen is you have a wonderful candidate who is potentially leaving a job to come and work at your place. And you have to keep that communication so sensitive and secure, but you need to be able to review the person's resume, and you need to be able to understand a bit about their background and have conversation about whether or not that person has the credentials that you're seeking in your new candidate. And all of that is incredibly sensitive information. It must be protected. So we were very glad to have a very secure system. No documents were ever emailed between the committee. No sensitive conversations were ever held outside the system. It was all encrypted, and it was all in one secure place. And the thing is, it didn't require us to meet in person at all. In fact, to this day, I still have not met our new executive director in person, even though she has been working since January 4th. So I hope to do that soon. Now that I'm vaccinated, I'm very hopeful that I'll get to meet her and at least bump elbows with her. But we just haven't been able to do it before now. So, Mark, I wonder if you could talk a bit about some of the use cases that you've listened to with other organizations. How does having one central place and organizing board information, how does that play out for other organizations?
Yeah, good question. I mean, certainly from speaking to organizations over the last few years, the key thing is ease of use, Dottie. It doesn't matter how good a piece of technology is. If it's not easy to use, then it won't be of advantage to your organization. So what we're finding with organizations is historically they had potentially a repository within their IT system for their staff, and that's where they held some level of documents. But when they try to expand that and give access to the trustees, that's where it fails over, because trustees don't have the same permissions to access an IT system within an NHS trust or any other type of organisation. So what we're finding with organisations, this gives a bridge. This gives one area where both the staff who are managing the board papers as well as the trustees have an equal space where all the documents are held in there. And what we're finding with organisations is they can actually manage this based on their governance processes. So if they want to have all the minutes for all the committees and boards in a single area, they can create that. And they can also have that level of control. So if, for example, maybe yourself, Dottie, and Kevin should only see certain documents, you can manage those permissions. And the key thing is, it's also within the control of the governance team. They don't have to contact the IT team to make a help desk request. So it gives them that agility to make those changes in a time fashion that's pertinent to them. From a trustee's perspective, they can go in there. So, for example, in your case, Dottie, a lot of new trustees that came on board in the last 14 months, they can go in there, get themselves up to speed with the archive meeting papers. So they go into the first meeting up to date and they have a knowledge of the organisation. But also from a governance perspective, other associated documents, code of conduct forms, conflict of interest forms, which are essential, all that can be held in here and it's available at a touch of a button. So it's about ease of use and, of course, improving the governance processes both for the internal team as well as the trustees. Dottie.
That all of that resonates so strongly for me, because I know one of the things that we also used our system to do was to onboard the new executive director. When she joined us, we had created a space with all the documents that we wanted her to review that had to do with the way that the board was organized and what was happening with the different committees, et cetera. And then we also have onboarded 4 new directors in the time of the pandemic. And so each one of those coming on board, we had a place where they could go and at their own pace and at their own time, look through some of the past meeting minutes, some of the past documents, because it's all very nicely organized and very easy to get to them without having to mail them a giant tome of paper. It just made it much, much easier for them to just have some self-paced exploration and find some things out. Of course, in addition to our standard onboarding program, which happened remotely. So, it's been a very interesting time to learn these lessons of how to do this well. Well, let's open up our final poll question here, because I'm curious to find out about what kinds of reporting do organizations do in terms of their board activities and engagement? This is another aspect of this pandemic that I think has taught us some interesting lessons. So let's go ahead and open up this new poll. This is another area, Mark, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, because tracking engagement for the board can be a bit of a sensitive topic, but is also very important. And especially in this time when we couldn't physically be together, sometimes it's a bit of a question. Are board members really fully engaged? Is anyone being left out because of the technological requirements? That's always a concern. I know on our board, we had a couple of individual directors who just really were struggling to use the video conferencing system early on. And so we took some extra time to provide coaching and support. We did that all remotely. We just made a phone call and then walked them through each of the steps to make sure that they were able to fully participate. And now they're doing great. But I'm curious to know your thoughts there around board engagement.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when reporting on board engagements, it's quite an interesting one, because speaking to existing clients, again, it goes back to the tools they have available to them. And certainly the clients I've spoken to, they've had Excel spreadsheets. They have to tally the information up on attendance, and it becomes quite a challenge, and they have to allocate a whole week at the end of the year to have that information. So a lot of the reporting I have found speaking to clients is based on the limitations of their existing processes, and that's where it's held at. And really, when you speak to them, the majority are open to new ideas and how much information they can report. It's essential to actually go forward as an organisation. They have to actually know where they are just now to actually make those improvements. So it will be interesting, because a lot of the clients I've spoken to, historically, it's been just tracking attendance, but as they evolve their governance processes with new tools, it has expanded to report in other areas, for example, diversity, etc., which we'll touch on, Dottie.
Well, let's go ahead and see what the results of this poll are. So we'll bring that up. So we've got just a little more than half that are just tracking attendance at board meetings, and then a little less than half that are tracking meeting attendance, but also attendance at other events. It's interesting. No one has marked something else. And so obviously the attendance of board members is something that we generally track. We put that into the minutes. But there are other ways to assess engagement. And I would say one of the things that has been kind of interesting throughout this pandemic is the level of communication and conversation for directors seems to have really ticked up. And we were hearing from directors in our reports that they were really feeling much more engaged during this time, partly because they had to use these digital tools, which is seems counterintuitive, but it's kind of interesting because they didn't have to travel to come to a meeting. Even if it was just getting in the car and going across town, it was very easy for them to make sure to attend. So we were seeing improved attendance at meetings. Even though there were more meetings, we were seeing improved attendance. That's really kind of fascinating. I don't know whether that is simply because there's not much else to do and everybody has finished watching everything on Netflix. And so being engaged at a board meeting is more fun than just staring at the same four walls. But we did see, a lot more engagement from directors during this time of having to be remote. There's no way to tell if that's causal or if that's just, coincidental, but it is interesting to note, because I think coming out of this pandemic, it'll be something to keep an eye on. Do we see a change in engagement because we are now, doing things in person again? My guess would be we don't. We probably continue to have this high level of engagement, but it's good to sort of figure out how you're going to handle reporting of these things. How are you going to track trends over time? So not just looking at, each individual meeting as one episode, but are there trends? Are we seeing trends across time with individual directors and the board as a whole in terms of the level of engagement? So let's just finish up here. Mark, do you want to kind of walk us through some of the different ways that you might think about approaching reporting on engagement? What would be some of the things that you could measure to try to understand how engaged the board is?
Yeah, I think it's quite fascinating, kind of what you mentioned about in the last slide there, Dottie, because the experience that we've had is reporting gives your governance team a great opportunity to see where you can actually make improvements. So the one you mentioned there about there's been evidence of increased participation because of remote meetings. So speaking to clients, what they're finding is with remote-based meetings, it opens up through their board evaluations to the diversity of the board. Can they actually look to involve external stakeholders who maybe were not comfortable coming into a large meeting room, but a remote-based meeting maybe allows a younger generation of trustees who have a young family who can actually allocate 2 hours based working from home. They can do remote meetings, whereas that was it stopped them from actually maybe participating, becoming a trustee or a board member. So that's interesting from that. The key things we've seen is, firstly, on board evaluations, what we've found is historically trustee or the people managing trustees have not had as much involvement with surveys or board evaluations because it's been quite a timely process, printing off paper, getting people to participate, complete their forms. But the feedback we've got is board members are enjoying the ability to do digital surveys because it gives them the ability to give their insights to the organisation, and then they can see the results of that and potential changes within the organisation. And secondly, from a diversity point of view, it really opens up the organisation to see where they are and they're tracking the diversity of the board. The board is not any different to any other employee within the organisation. They have the Equality Act, and it gives an organisation the ability to actually review and see where their board is in relation to their external stakeholders, and do they have a broad range of people who are on the board. I was reading an article quite recently, and I think it was dated 2018, and indicated within non-executive directors within the NHS, 90% are aged over 50. So given a strong reporting to your governance team, that allows you then to actually see where your metrics are and how you can actually evolve that and make changes if you desire. Certainly from an internal point of view, I've highlighted staff, board time and costs, because ultimately it's your internal team who are actually managing these processes. And if it's a cumbersome process, then of course you'll get that lack of engagement for your internal team. And certainly speaking to our client last week, what they're looking to do is actually build more board evaluations, but make it specific to the individual committee so they can be quite granular on that type of survey. And then, of course, have that ability to archive that information and see where there's trends there. And one of the key drivers it always comes back to is around control. Giving your internal governance team that ability to control what information they give to the board members, because ultimately, with information in a timely manner, the trustees can make those right decisions in a digital age. Dottie?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark. Well, this brings us to a period where we'd just like to take some questions from the audience, and I'm keeping an eye on the question box here. But Kevin, I wonder if you would mind joining us and let us know if there are any questions that have come in, or just any questions that you have that you'd like to know more about.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, interesting discussion. There's a couple of things that come to me. I'm conscious of trusts' need to engage the public when they have board sessions too. They're public parts. And we haven't really touched on that and the extent to which, and I know digital has enabled it. I've seen it in terms of some of the chat and conversations that we've had. I'm just wondering if there's experience that you can share about what to be bold about or things to watch out for in terms of how we share information and engage in that way using digital.
Certainly. Mark, I'll kind of take a pass at this and then I'll hand it over to you because I bet you have some other things to add. But that's a great point, Kevin. And you're so right. We have to be able to do that well. The last thing we want to do is start to use these digital solutions, having a mind towards securing board information and disenfranchise the public. That's not the point. So one of the things that has been really interesting is using these digitalized solutions actually increases the level of access with the public. We found this not just in the healthcare space, but also in the corporate space. So listed companies having their annual general meetings, many of them had to go to having digital annual general meetings this year for the first time ever. And what was really fascinating, there has been so much concern. All the proxy advisors for years have been telling shareholders to vote against companies that have virtual AGMs because they were so afraid it wouldn't allow shareholders to really have a voice. They would get cut out of the conversation. It was going to be controlled by the company. And so there would be no opportunity for dissent or activism. And quite the opposite happened. They actually had higher engagement. More people participated in the AGMs than historically have ever done so. And it was actually easier for them to ask questions and raise objections and raise points during the meeting at the times that that's appropriate than it was if they were in person. Because in person, what they found is that they really had to make a big physical show to get anyone's attention. But when they were digital, it's a very even playing field. Everyone's in their own little box, and you can type something into the chat. You can raise a hand and get noticed, and the moderator would very easily be able to see somebody trying to get attention and would be able to give that person the floor. So this digital environment has actually kind of increased that public engagement. And then in terms of how the secure board platform works, Mark, maybe you could talk a bit about, you brought up the issue of control, and control is about access, right? So you have the ability to control, what's appropriate for the public to see. The information that must be protected can stay protected, but all of the public information can be made opened, correct?
Absolutely, you're right. I mean, control is about access to it, and certainly from a governance team perspective, it's a very stressful role. There's times when it's very challenging for them, and what we've found with the board portal is it gives them that level of control whereby they can have a copy easily available for the trustees, but also they can have a control version which may be redacted for the public, as well as copies available for maybe guest speakers who have to come in and give an update, certainly on health issues that may happen. So what we're finding, there is greater engagement, but also it gives the governance team peace of mind that the information that's getting sent out and disseminated is the correct versions, Dottie.
Kevin, did you have some other thoughts or questions coming in that you might want to share?
Sure. I think I'm very struck by the need to share information rather than the actual attachments. I was, you opened up with that point about, this is how things get out and things get in, and that's what you need to avoid. One of the kind of default solutions is Microsoft and SharePoint and links and stuff like that. And it's not the same as a customized solution that you and others offer. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on what are the benefits, what are the kind of things that our members here should be saying, okay, how do we leverage the benefits of a customized solution over, say, SharePoint or something like that? I mean, they have their place, of course, but just interested in why, what the main benefits of a customized solution. You've been talking about a lot of them. Just to pull them through a wee bit.
Sure. Maybe I'll give a governance perspective, and then Mark, if you don't mind chiming in, that would be great. So from a governance perspective, I'll just speak for our own board. We use a purpose-built solution specifically for governance. And the reason that is important is then we didn't have to take responsibility to build that in SharePoint, right? Because the issue is SharePoint is a very powerful system and is great, for companies and internal communication. But it's got a couple of issues. One is if you wanted to use it for board communication, you would have to take responsibility to build that out and build the capabilities and functionality you want. And you would have to control all the access. And if you've got a full-time IT team dedicated to your board, maybe that's the direction you decide to go. That didn't make sense for us. Instead, we wanted something that was very secure, but incredibly light, because it can work on any device. And that's been a little bit of a barrier. I can tell you, it's interesting. We use SharePoint internally at Diligent for just managing our corporate documents, just, passing things back and forth. And it's a huge hassle every time we have to send something, for example, to a reporter or to a member of our PR team, which is a third-party agency, because they don't have the same system. And so it always, invariably, there is always an error message. Every single time I try to do this, they get an error message. It drives me crazy. And you can imagine with a board, that would be 100% of the communications. You would always be getting the error message because of the permissions. And so it's just much harder. It can be done. I'm not saying that this is an inherent issue with SharePoint. I'm saying that the way that we have it set up, you'd have to set it up completely differently for using in board circumstances. So Mark, I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, it's very similar. And I think it's also about governance and is more than just the meeting papers, isn't it? And so speaking to professionals who are looking at changing the existing processes, they've got a wealth of tools they have to use, Kevin. So they've got, as you say, potentially SharePoint, which is a fabulous tool, fit for purpose for certain aspects. But really, as a governance professional, you're sending out papers and you have to pull that down from a tool, for example, SharePoint, send it out. But there's other roles which I've just mentioned about reporting. Do you hold that in an Excel spreadsheet, which is on some type of device and other people can't get to that? Digital signatures signing minutes of meetings, that's been a key problem for organisations over the last 14, 15 months. How do you do that? Do you then go to another third-party tool to get an electronic digital signature, or do you include that? So what we're finding is organisations are tired of using 5, 6, 7 different tools to complete their task, where they can all have it in one secure portal. Absolutely, Kevin.
Yeah, nice answer. Those are my kind of immediate questions, Dottie, in terms of listening to you. I think it's, I don't know if there's any other thoughts that you guys have to share, and I'm conscious we're approaching the hour now.
Well, let's say a few things just in wrap up. I know we had kind of a wide ranging conversation. We touched on a number of different topics, but when you start to think about the combination of security and board communication, there is a lot of ground to cover, right? It's not just about, picking the right solution. It's also about how you apply it and use it. And what is it that you're actually trying to accomplish? And so maybe I would just leave people with thinking of a couple things. One is that remembering that cybersecurity and cyber risk is such a critical topic for every organization. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir there probably, but it's incredibly important for the board to be dealing with that. And as we saw in our poll results, may not be dealing with it with the level of frequency that is really required for the existential threat that it actually represents. Just replace the word cyber in the term cyber risk, replace the word cyber with financial, and then think of how your board would approach that. And really, that's the same kind of posture you should be taking with cyber. I bet there's not a board meeting that goes by that you don't talk about the finance. So why would that be true, for cyber, which ostensibly is a bigger existential threat than financial risk, to be honest. So definitely kind of taking a different posture and a different approach to it. And then remembering that securing board information and just digitalizing board communication has to be done really intentionally and well in order to get you the benefit that you really need. Having one place to store everything, making sure that's secure. To Mark's point, the board papers are not the only thing that you're trying to do. You want to make sure that you have the full governance process really supported and secured, and think that through well. Mark, any final parting thoughts?
No, I think that's summed it up excellent. And I really, certainly from myself and Dottie, we really appreciate the opportunity for this session today. And thank you very much for your time, Kevin, and all the participants. It's been a great opportunity for us to discuss this subject.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank you and Dottie as well for your insight and wisdom. These things are very important, and often we sort of put them in the background and let other people worry about them. So I'm sure the audience here have appreciated kind of having the opportunity to think more deeply about the issues that we're grappling with in terms of how we get an effective board working. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll close the session here and wish everyone well.